All right, so let's jump into it. Okay. So I gave you the intro aside. Now we had to prototype. There's a great book by Eric Ries called The Lean Startup. And in that book, he explains several different types of prototypes you can create. And a lot of times people wrongly assume, right? This is why I'm writing a book on assumptions for product managers, because we can assume a lot. We assume that prototypes have to be in code, right? You develop a early prototype using code. And that's an expensive way to prototype, right? You can, draw a design on a brick and explain a phone, right? And that's pretty cheap and quick. So my whole thing was, how can I cheaply, quickly, since I can't code, I'm not a developer, right? I can do some HTML. And if you have a development background, you're probably laughing at me because it takes like a day to learn HTML. That's about all I got, maybe some CSS. But kidding aside, I'm not a developer. Even if I was, it would be expensive with my time to go and develop a working prototype. So for me, how could I cheaply, effectively validate a bridge, a solution, the bridge, before I actually built something? Okay. So my goal was to validate an MVP. And in Eric Ries's book, one of the types of prototypes that was mentioned is a concierge, right? And at a high level, a concierge MVP is just taking what you would automate through software and doing it manually, right? So one of the insights I got that I didn't mention in the last video was, or I did mention it, but I'll expound upon it. So a very, very common way that aspiring PMs look for PM jobs, is through coursework, whether it's an MBA or an online course. And so there's this concept of mental models. If you can position what you're doing and frame it within the mental model of how people are already used to doing something, you have a much higher likelihood for success. Okay. So knowing what I knew about how they approach looking for jobs, and as a side note, I interviewed way more than 5 people for each of those personas. So the insights were robust, right? I didn't just stop at 5. It was probably like, we're like 20 per group. Because as I noticed that as I went through geographies, I'm like, if I interview one person from New York, one person from Nigeria, one person from Singapore, that might not be enough per geography. So I got at least 5 people per geo. So just as a side note for the research effort, depending on your situation, 5 might not be enough. And it wasn't for me. So going back to the online course-based learning, that was the idea for the prototype. But then again, like that would be expensive to build all kind of course content like I'm doing now without any real understanding of what could be successful, right? I have validated manually that this strategy framework works. And so I'm teaching you now through a course so I can scale out this knowledge of what works so you can be successful and get credibility in your career as a PM. And it's the same mentality, right? So this concierge MVP, manually doing the thing that we want to automate later through a course and through a platform and a community. I decided to do some coaching. So I invested a lot of my time into my first cohort was 5 people, right? From around the world, because I still needed that global input. Okay. And I needed to keep elements of the previous guiding policy of think global. So I had someone from Canada, someone from the US, Singapore, Nigeria, and Germany. Yeah. And so very global. And three of these individuals finished, right? So I had an interesting idea about drop-off rates, which getting a little ahead of myself, but I kind of tucked that in the back of not everyone's going to finish this, which is a good thing, by the way. Anyone can finish a 2-hour course of somebody talking to you, but doing something where you learn it and then you go do it, it helps you understand 2 things. Do I really want to do this job? And then 2, am I willing to put in the work to get to where I want to go? And if you can answer yes to both of those questions, then you're already much more likely to get the job, than someone who isn't willing to put in the work and do the work that it requires to be good at this job. So to me, it was a win. I didn't care. Like a 60% completion rate was great for me. And I just kind of stumbled upon that as we went through it. But I was coaching each of these sections. So I validated in the first phase, here are the different types of skills you need to have. So I had to come up with, how do I teach this, right? I do this, but how do I teach this in a way that somebody can take it and replicate it? Okay. And so that was my challenge, was how do I validate the effectiveness of the experience, right? And how can we present this to hiring managers in a way that resonates? All right. So the challenge baked in there is, how do I create a curriculum that's digestible, that someone can take it and go implement what they've just learned on their own, as if they're PMing a real product with real users? Because that's what we do now. We take real companies' products and we find real users of those products. You interview them, you get feedback, and you iterate on that, or you form a hypothesis based on the feedback, right? Sound familiar? And then you go and test those hypotheses through different steps of validation, and you prepare for launch. It's a very high level, watered down version of what we do. But just to give you some insight, like that's what it's become. And it kind of started out that way, but it's evolved and gotten a lot more crisp over time. So for this part, we understood what our challenge was, right? Now we needed a guiding policy. So my guiding policy was go from concierge to automated, because I can't do one-on-one coaching forever. I have a day job, and maybe one day this becomes my full-time thing. But for now, I have a day job, so I had to figure out how to get it automated. And so the idea was go from completely concierge coaching to a hybrid model that was, okay, now we know what content works, what resonates, where I need to go deeper, where I don't need to spend as much time. Now let's create the video content. And so the second phase of that MVP iteration, right, was get another cohort, give them the videos, and then at the end of the video, there's an assignment. And then we come back and we meet a week later and they show me what they did, and I give them feedback and coaching on what they did. Instead of like personally teaching, I automated the teaching element through videos, right? But I still had that personal connection, so I can get feedback on what they learned, what made sense, what didn't. And then I could iterate on those videos for the next person in the cohort, right? So that's kind of how I iterated towards this automated model, to make sure that even in the video content, they grasped it, they got it, and they could execute on what they were learning. And so the actions was, I needed to build the content, right? First manually, the content for me to teach, and then deliver the concierge coaching, right? And then I needed to iterate on the content based on the feedback. What didn't make sense? Where did I need to go deeper? And then I needed to also develop a project portfolio template. So as they're doing the things that I'm teaching them to do, whether it's market research or running user interviews or leveraging the prioritization framework based on the problems they've uncovered, and how do they prioritize that against the goal of the company they're working on behalf of, then how do they document all this in a way that if we can hand it to a hiring manager at that company or at another company, that it makes sense. And they're like, oh man, this person knows what they're doing. Like, they get it. I love the process. That's the kind of qualitative success that I was looking for out of hiring managers. And I'll show you an example of that later in the course, which I'm super proud of. But the expected outcomes I had of these coherent actions were, I needed 5 PMs who had confidence in their experience gained, right? I needed portfolio projects that resonated with hiring managers. And I wanted at least one person in that cohort to get hired. And I wanted all of them to get interviews. Granted, none of these aspiring PMs had previous experience as a product manager. The experience was all across the board, right? Sales. One was in user experience, which was like the closest thing. Project management, which is not as close as you would think. And there was a variety of experiences, but every single one who finished got an interview. And out of the 3 out of 5 who finished, 2 of the 3 got hired. And I'm super proud of that. But it was super validating, right? And again, going back to what I said in previous videos, You want to look to invalidate what you're trying to do, trying to prove yourself wrong. So that way, if you keep being right, like you're onto something. It's not just confirmation bias of what you think is right. You're actually trying to prove it tangibly. So with that, I hope that helps in showing phase one to phase two how this strategy framework helped to focus what we did and how it led to success, right? So you're going to see going from phase two to phase three, how we approached actually launching Path to Product in the platform that you see today. So as we stand in May of 2021, the first version of the Path to Product experience course still exists in its current form. I'm going to work on actually revising that, and based on the feedback I've gotten, make that better as well. And so that's a work in progress. But if you're on path to product.io today, you'll still see the first version that I launched in December, about 5 months ago, if my math is right. So in the next video, we're going to go through phase three. I'm not going to spend time on the roadmap for phase two, but you'll see how that kind of step-by-step roadmap breaks out with these coherent actions in the phase three. But what I will say is that in coherent actions for phase two, you can start seeing how these can be turned into epics, right? So if you're familiar, if you've done product management work before, epics are kind of like a big chunk of something that you need to do, and you can break those into stories. Again, we cover that in the course. And the stories are the independently shippable things, right? So building the content, one video might be a story, but the content itself is the epic, right? And so on the roadmap, you might put the epics of what you need to do. So build the content, deliver the coaching, iterate, develop a project portfolio, and iterate on the template based on feedback. Like those could be a very chronologically laid out order for what you need to do. So with that, I'll leave you to think about what could come next, right? As you finished phase one for your day job or the startup that you're working on, do you have a vision of what's to come? If you have a longer term vision, you might have an idea of what phase two might look like. And so if you do, don't hesitate to start writing in some ideas. It might change as you execute on phase one. Phase two might change, but try to think ahead. Like product managers, it's debated whether or not we're supposed to be visionary, but if you have that visionary drive in your gut, right? Don't be afraid to start filling out phase two. And with that, I'll see you as we kind of break down phase three and what we did to launch Path to Product.